the story behind the market's rise for years now, with companies helping to support stock prices and boost their own earnings reports at the same time. But the pandemic led many companies to pull back their horns, suspend buybacks, and help save cash amid unprecedented business uncertainty. Just how far did buyback activity decrease in the year 2020? Well, S&P 500 companies paid out just shy of $520 billion last year for their own stock. That's nearly a 29% decline from just the year prior. But buybacks are showing some signs of life. In the second quarter, during the height of the pandemic, they were around $88 billion spent. By Q3, it was $101 billion. By the fourth quarter, it was $130 billion. Now, that acceleration in stock buybacks is gaining even more steam today, with analysts at Bank of America noting that we are now back to record levels in terms of corporate spending on buybacks. So which kind of companies are doing the most work? Where is all the buying happening? Well, it's technology. They spent about $56 billion worth there. Communication services, media companies, $16 billion. Healthcare companies spent $15 billion. And the financials, $13 billion spent on buybacks. The biggest share repurchasers are some of the usual suspects. We're talking about Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, Alphabet, Microsoft, Charter Communications, Oracle. So all of those guys are still, yes, buying back their own stock. Where do we go from here? For this year, Howard Silverblatt of S&P Dow Jones Indices says more companies are expected to return back to the buyback market as they look to have enough to cover their employee stock options and, depending on cash flow, reduce those share counts, giving a boost to their earnings per share. Big banks, which have received approval to resume buybacks in the coming weeks, are expected to be one of the bigger players in that market. And of course, technology will continue to dominate as it has over the past few years. And of course, we can't talk buybacks without bringing up Apple. Apple is the undisputed king. Did you know that Apple is now responsible for 13 of the 14 biggest quarterly buybacks of all time, and each of the 5 biggest spends by any one company in a quarter? So, could the return of the buyback put a floor beneath the market and lead to another leg higher? Let's now bring in Kim Forrest, Chief Investment Officer with Boca Capital Partners, and Ernesto Ramos, Chief Investment Officer with BMO Global Asset Management. Thank you both for being with us here. Kim, let me start with you. The buyback story, it's been supportive of the markets. Will it be again?
Well, it certainly sounds so, and especially in technology, with the companies that have so much cash, they don't know what to do with it. I don't think anybody could accuse Microsoft of not being a wise user of its cash, and whenever they do acquisitions, they're pretty much writing a check for it, not going and borrowing for it. So I think those are all more, and these are the companies that do give stock options as part of the benefits packages. So it is, kind of a more honest way to conduct buybacks. You have the cash and you're doing it for a reason.
Is it a signal, Ernesto? Is it a signal that things are getting back to normal when companies feel comfortable enough to let those horns out again, so to speak, and go back and buy back their own stock?
For sure. 2020 was very restricted in terms of buybacks. Some of the sectors, like the banks, could not buy back their stock by mandate or by law, and now they've announced $35 billion. The financials have announced $35 billion worth of buybacks coming forward. So it's a great way to return capital to shareholders, especially if you consider there's a tax differential. You're going to pay capital gains on those stocks that you own, versus if you get a dividend or a special dividend, you're going to get a tax as ordinary income. So it's a good way to spend their money and return it to shareholders.
So Ernesto, if I might follow up there, if that is the case, is there a way that investors play it? Is there a way that investors try to capitalize on this new resurgence in buybacks back to pre-pandemic levels?
Well, one of the sectors that we like is financials, and not because of the buybacks, but simply because it's so cheap. Big banks are so cheap. You have Citicorp, for example, trading at under 10 times earnings. And with the steepness of the yield curve that you see now, with value being back in play, with GDP growth for 2021 coming in probably in the neighborhood of 7+%, banks are a great way to play all of those things in one single place, which is buying that sector. So we like them for all those reasons.
Kim, I wonder, I mentioned before the idea that companies buy back stock. It's a way of engineering better earnings per share. You reduce the share count and then everybody's earnings kind of go up in that way. You're an analyst by nature, by trade. Do you have to look beyond that to see whether or not a company's really healthy or whether or not the earnings growth is driven strictly by buybacks?
I think you do, especially if you're a longer term holder. What you're trying to do is by increasing cash flows. And yes, buybacks can at least, your slice of the pie is getting larger by the company doing a buyback, but it also isn't necessarily growing the cash flow. Ultimately, what you want is a company that's growing that cash flow, and you have to do the math, make sure that this year's share count isn't remarkably smaller than last year's, and just look at the cash. Maybe that's the easy way to do it, not on a cash per share basis, but just look at cash flow and see that, the company's performing better last year or this year over last year.
Kim, we just got a few moments left here. Any favorite parts of the market for you right now for the next 6 to 9 months?
Well, I do like technology always, but I actually am looking at materials and steel companies in particular, just given the Biden administration's focus on infrastructure and, some spending that should be happening in America here.
Is cyclical, Ernesto, before we let you go, is cyclical spending tied to infrastructure going to be the next big theme? I seem to recall every time a new presidential term starts, we always talk about infrastructure spending.
We think so. I mean, Biden is more committed to spending money.
All right. I think we just lost Ernesto there with the feed. All right.
We think it'll certainly be one of those, one of the sectors.
All right. Perfect. Thank you guys very much there.